Estamos transmitiendo. Muy buenos días a todos, o tardes ya a los que nos están observando en este momento, o podrán ver la conferencia en cualquier otro periodo de tiempo. Estamos aquí para lo que vendría siendo la conferencia magistral de las cuartas jornadas de estudios hegelianos que se llevaron aproximadamente hace un mes aquí en la Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, con el doctor Frank Rudda. La conferencia será impartida en inglés, sin embargo, les incito propiamente, si es que tuvieran algún comentario, a dejarlo en español para que estén más cómodos, si así gustan, pues nosotros nos encargaremos de traducirlo sin ningún problema. Tendremos primero la interferencia del doctor Frank Rudda y después la del doctor Fernando Huesca Ramón. And for the English-speaking people, I'm basically telling you that you're very much welcome to this workshop conference from Dr. Frank Rudda. We are going to have the interaction with him, in which he will have about 45 minutes of conference, and then we will pass to the part where the Dr. Fernando Huesca from here, the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, is going to help us and go deep on whatever Professor Rudda has to say. I'm going to read a little curriculum vitae from the Professor Frank Rudda in Spanish, so we can be a little bit familiar with him. I will try also to point out the essential parts in English so you can understand completely what I'm saying. Dr. Frank Rudda es profesor titular de filosofía y jefe disciplinar en la Universidad de Dundee, en Scotland. Es un miembro del Scottish Centre for Continued Philosophy y profesor Continental Philosophy y profesor visitante en el Institute of Philosophy en el Scientific Research Center de la Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts de Ljubljana, en Eslovenia. Rudda estudió Philosophy and Literature, literatura alemana, en la Ruhr University de Bochum y en la École Pratique des Hautes Études en París. Después fue invitado en el programa de posgrado Forms of Life and the Know-How of Living en las universidades de Potsdam y Viadriana, donde obtuvo su doctorado en filosofía en el año 2008 con una tesis sobre Hegel. En 2017, Rudda recibió su venia legendi para la enseñanza de la filosofía de la Libre Universidad de Berlín con una tesis de habilitación titulada Peor que el error, indiferencia y fatalism, Worse than Error, Indifference and Fatalism. Ha enseñado en diversas universidades como la Universidad Capital Normal de Beijing, la Universidad de Nanjing, la Universidad de Weimar, la Universidad Goethe de Frankfurt y la Universidad de Potsdam. En adición a diversas colecciones editadas y capítulos de libros, es autor de varios textos: Indifference and Repetition, con prefacio de Alain Badiou, Abolishing Freedom, A Plea for a Contemporary Use of Fatalism, Hegel's Rebel and Reading Marx, con Agon Ham y Slavoj Žižek. Además, también es coeditor de la revista Crisis and Critique y es coautor de una alumna, es coautor en el Philosophical Salon D en Los Angeles Review of Books. Un pequeño error ahí de redacción. Entonces, sin ningún otro anticipo, you may speak, Dr. Frank. A pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here, and I'm sorry we delayed this once. But it's an honor. It truly is, and I'm not only saying that. This is why the German title, want to say something and think through a peculiar concept that appears in particular passages, crucial passages in Hegel, and that in German is rendered as entlassen, and in English is rendered as release. If that is appropriate, we can talk about this. And part of this is my attempt to grapple with Hegel's philosophy of nature. Not with the entirety of it, but with how we get into the philosophy of nature. And hopefully this will make sense to you. And I'm still thinking through this while reading it to you. Hegel's concept of nature has had a strange career. It had been widely either neglected or ridiculed, and its press was never great to begin with. His philosophy of nature would, if there were a competition, certainly be one of the parts of his system that were the least valued since its very conception. It was so problematic that almost any study of Hegel's philosophy of nature published in the last 30 years or more had to start with an acknowledgement of the level of discredit it had received. It was so bad, as William Maker paradigmatically claimed over 20 years ago, I quote, "Nowadays nothing is more dead than Hegel's philosophy of nature," unquote. And the only way to start making it better was to accept and admit how bad it was. But within the overall conjuncture of philosophies of nature returning and against the background, I think, of contemporary rereadings of Hegel, the interest in the latter's conception of nature started, may one dare say, to grow. There has been a noticeable increase, even though still comparatively small, in the number of investigations that address aspects of Hegel's philosophy of nature. These considered inter alia how Hegel accounts for spirit's emergence from nature and how spirit conceives of nature through and in the form of a philosophy of nature. What I'm trying to do now will draw on some of this work, and by seeking to understand in what sense precisely the concept of nature entails the articulation of what one could say a necessary condition of possibility for the coming to be of a fully fledged subjectivity. That's a formulation of Adrian Johnston. I will try to examine crucial aspects of what Hegel calls nature. I will thereby reconstruct in what sense this very concept allows to articulate specific requirements for a philosophical robust conception of nature, drawing on a selection of, you will see, I mean, I can't unfold the entire argument through historically, but I will give you different, let's say, discursive formats or discursive reflections or discursive, I will draw on different discursive types, namely on biographical and anecdotal, and in the end, systematic material, and thereby quite heterogeneous material. And what you will see is I'm thereby, that is at least the formal point, I'm trying to mimic the very structure of what Hegel addresses and calls nature in a different form. Since for nature holds, I think, and that is now Adorno, that the idea that the a priori is also the a posteriori, unquote, that what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to elucidate is this very claim. How can the a posteriori be also the a priori and vice versa? And there is not always a vice versa at stake, but you will see what I mean by this. So this elaboration will indicate what kind of problems Hegel seeks to avoid with this concept of nature, and will indicate why it is crucial, I think, for any contemporary revival of a philosophy of nature not to regress behind Hegel's achievements. So it will show, so I will try to show how Hegel's philosophical concept of nature, because it is both philosophical and a concept, applies a specific form of denaturalization. And that is my first qualification of what I will then be talking about in terms of Entlassen later on. So a denaturalization of the very concept it deals with when it deals with the concept of nature. Why do we need to think nature at all? Would it not also be possible to simply ignore it, not care about it? This might at first sight appear to be a rather idiotic question. But how does one precisely determine and understand the modality that connects thought and nature? Is the thought of nature necessary, and thereby nature a concept that thought cannot not have? If this may be so, it is because otherwise thought would not adequately, maybe that would be an option, right? Adequately understand itself as in its own nature. We might be unavoidably tempted to naturalize thinking when we do not think the nature of thinking as such, right? But what would thought think when it thinks nature if nature is not thought, because it is nature, even though it is thought because, well, it is thought, right? Actively thought. In Hegel, nature crops up from early on and in the most central places of a system of absolute idealism. So central that Frederick C. Beiser could write in modifying Plato, I quote, "Above the portals of the Academy of Absolute Idealism, there is written the inscription, 'Let no one enter who has not studied Naturphilosophie,' so nature philosophy," unquote. But why is that so? Before the times of absolute idealism, Beiser means Schelling and Hegel, Kant was able to state in his 1786 Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science in the very first sentence, I quote, "The word nature, taken simply in its formal meaning means the inner principle of all that belongs to the existence of a thing, unquote. But nature, quote again, is also taken otherwise in its material meaning, not as constitution, but as the sum total of things, insofar as they can be objects of our senses and thus of all experience. So do we need to think nature, that's now me again, because at one point we're forced to conceive of the sum total of our experience and the inner principle of all things? Hegel will give this a different twist. He endorses the view that thinking cannot but generate the concept of nature as that which is thought thinking itself, but in the form of otherness. And so I'm approaching, again, the concept of Entlassen, and I'm not always certain we can get to that in the discussion, if that always in each and every passage in Hegel's work and ever operates according to only one model, and you already hear me saying that it doesn't. This is to say that thinking, when it seeks to understand itself, does so obviously by means of thinking. Thereby it starts to create an idea of thinking, but it cannot but also generate an idea of what the conditions and what the result of thinking are, where thought emerges from, and what it cannot but be also related to. In and through nature, when we then might be able to think what occurs at and as the end of thought, as that which it must take and think as its own presupposition, as a condition of its own beginning to conceive of itself properly. Right? It doesn't leave itself, but it sort of leaves itself. But is this not precisely the cliché of the powers of creative narcissism, of an absolute idealist who finds spirit even where there is none, and thereby ultimately, whatever this then means precisely, sublates everything that is other than itself? Does to think nature not thereby in advance mean never to think nature as such in itself, but only for us? Is then nature just spirit's slightly tainted mirror? But if, as we will see in a bit, I think, nature is what unavoidably and prominently returns at the very end of thought's attempt to grasp itself, thought on some level cannot stop thinking about nature, does nature's return yet again not also point toward another form of relating thinking and nature? Hegel will demonstrate that on the peak of thought, creatively realizing an appropriate form of grasping itself, namely in the form of creatively thinking, the form of creative thinking, nature returns as something that cannot simply be derived from thought. Rather, it returns after thinking seems to have done all it could do, as if nature occurred at the point of, or as an exhaustion of thought. And you see that I'm moving right now from the Entlassen to something like exhaustion. I mean, these are just, let's say, experimental concepts, as Adorno would have labeled them. But does Hegel's concept entail such an exorcism of thought by itself, and what would this effectively mean and amount to? As is well documented, Hegel engaged almost throughout his life with nature, even though his actual publications on natural matters are effectively quite limited, and he never published a book on the philosophy of nature, which would not have been purposed in advance as being teaching material for his university courses. So these are teaching tools, right, in the encyclopedia, as you all know. But they have a different status, I think, as, for example, the phenomenology or the science of logic. Some of his engagements with natural matters have even acquired the status of paradigmatic anecdotes, which are supposed to evidence Hegel's ridiculous views on and treatment of nature, as well as of the natural sciences. One of these stories, as you may know, concerns his early habilitation treatise, Dissertatio Philosophica de Orbitis Planetarum. The anecdote is that Hegel is supposed to have argued that there can be no other planet between the fourth and the fifth planet of the solar system, Mars and Jupiter. But on the 1st of 1801, a few months before Hegel actually came up with this deduction, Giuseppe Pazzi, an astronomer, proved the existence of the very thing that Hegel will then claim impossible. The embarrassment of the philosopher's idea about nature when confronted with real scientific fact is obviously what this anecdote was supposed to express. It is here that Hegel, again anecdotal and infamous dictum also about nature, that if the facts do not comply with the theory, it is even worse for the facts, appears at first sight to be even worse fact, an even worse fact for Hegel, right? Simply wrong in the sense. But he appears to be a kind of modern Thales, one could say. But different from his ancient predecessor, he did not fall into the metaphorical well while looking at the stars and because he was riveted by nature. Rather, the opposite, he made himself into a laughing matter precisely because he was not looking at matter, namely nature, properly, but tried to dictate its laws from the outside. Yet Hegel's comment on the Thales anecdote, so that is now Hegel commenting on the Thales anecdote, might already point toward a possible rebuttal. He wrote, "The people laugh at such things and boast that philosophers cannot tell them about such things. But they do not understand that philosophers laugh at them, for they do not fall into a ditch because they lie in one for all time and because they cannot see what exists above them." So it is almost a Heideggerian pun that Hegel here makes, excuse the anachronism, by basically saying the condition of those who are not seeing that this is problematic is that of fallenness already, of a certain throneness or fallenness. So when a philosophy of nature, this is now me again, makes people anecdotally laugh, this is, here Hegel's point, the laughter might be the symptom of a more profound disorientation about where the ditch is. Was there not a fall that still determines our existence, according to some? About what the laughing matter really is, and ultimately about what laughter should be triggered by. Philosophy proves itself here again to be denaturalizing, I think, looking, if not for a way out, then at least for another perspective on the ditch, on the well, and thereby denaturalizing even the natural ways in which we behave or think or love. Now, there's another well-known anecdote, and you see I'm starting anecdotally, right? And then the second bit will be more a reading of the actual published book material. There's yet another well-known anecdote that dates back even earlier, but that leads us more directly to examine Hegel's relation to nature. In 1796, Hegel took a trip to the Bernese Alps. His friends dragged him there, I quote Hegel, in order to become aware of and to admire the stunning beauty of the scenery there. Hegel writes a diary. He notes that when passing the Lauterbrunnen Valley, I quote again, the height of the cliff from which it, the creek, cascades has on its own something great. The Staubach, that's the creek, rather not, unquote. The spray the creek produces, quote again, has something quaint, unquote, but one does not see in it, quote again, a power as great force that the thought of the coercion, of the must, of the must, of das Muss of nature remains aloof, unquote. Rather, what Hegel identifies as what he calls the animate in which permanently dissolves, das immer sich auflösende, burst apart, das auseinanderspringende, of the creek cascading down the mountain is, I quote again, the image of a free play, unquote. Nature removes the idea of necessity, but creates an image linked to the, quote again, gracious, unconstrained, free downplay, Niederspielen in German, of the spray, unquote. The combination of the unmoved and unmoving great cliff and the lively small stream endlessly and freely crashing, rushing, and dying down in a pile of inconsistent spray creates the image of a free play, because therein manifests the freedom of this connection of stone and water, of the unmoved and the moving, the dead and the somehow animate, which is pre-animate, obviously, because it's water. Right? And this concatenation that evaporates as if into spray, the idea that there's anything necessary in this very concatenation. Nature thus, for the early Hegel, because of its material composition, where there manifests no necessity, evaporates into spray the idea of necessary connections and inferences. Nature is not at all simply the realm of necessity, as it was so often represented. In view of the glacier of Grindelwald, Hegel noted that one does not see anything of further interest in the gigantic masses. There's no need for hermeneutic of suspicion, or for the hermeneutic suspicion or deconstructive analysis. Looking at nature demands for any spirited being, I quote, a new mode of seeing, which gives no new occupation to spirit other than that it notices that it is in the strongest heat of the summer so close to the masses of ice. That was Hegel. It takes a new mode of seeing to see that nature can combine things in a way that does not exhibit any kind of necessity, barely makes any sense, and can even generate apparent inconsistency, like ice and strongest heat. Which does not even form a contradiction, right? They're just next to one another. That's his point there. Sorry. This new mode of seeing is a mode that avoids seeing necessity and consistency where there's none. It is just seeing what is there in its non-necessity and non-sense and nothing else. This implies not to see what is not there, and thus to see that what there is to simply see, or is to see simply what there is to see. Nature is what appears to be, is what it appears to be. There's no deeper meaning or anything else behind it. Hegel adds to this after leaving Gutanen, another local village, that, I quote, the Aar, a river, does make some splendid waterfalls, crushing down with tremendous power, unquote. And when traversing a bridge, quote again, on which one is moistened by the dust, unquote, of water, yet can get a good look at the waves of the river, he notes that, quote again, nowhere else do we obtain such a pure concept of the must, vom Müssen of nature, unquote. There is no must, muss, but a pure need, a musting, a müssen of nature, and thus a dialectic of muss and müssen. It has immense powers that push forward and out of it. They create and spill over. And this is what it must do. Yet there is no necessity and thus no structuring must within it. Nature needs and has to produce, generate, create, destroy, etc., but is without necessity. Nature is like a conscious subject that has some pure concept of duty, but one that is so empty that there's nothing aligning and bringing together the productions except that they are produced. So it's a subject that is not really a subject, right? In nature, we thus encounter a pure need and must do it without necessity. There's nothing determining how and in what way, if consistent or not. Ein Müssen ohne Muss, one could say. Such necessity without necessity becomes particularly manifest in the shapes of mountains that have been formed by massive natural forces over almost endless periods of time, but which exhibit no purpose or telos whatsoever. Hegel, I doubt whether here even the most faithful theologian would dare to attribute to nature itself in the mountains the purpose of usability to men, unquote. Let's say not even physical theology that identifies and justifies God's existence from nature's creation allows us to see purpose in such manifestations of nature, so that Hegel seems to suggest, if you want to free someone from especially physical theological beliefs about nature, just take her to the Alps. There's obviously no purpose, no sense, no usability to the mountains and its shapes. They're contingent. This is right what later Dieter Heinrich will overemphasize or emphasize correctly. Nature can be so unusable that it materializes and indicates in and through its own material appearance its utter purposelessness to men. The message is then that there is no message, and hence the medium, which is none, is again the message, which is therefore also none. Looking at the shapes of mountains with the new mode of seeing, Spirit and Hegel sees no aim or end. One sees only meaninglessness and uselessness. One sees that there is nothing to see. Therefore, Hegel remarks consistently that, I quote, neither the eye nor the imagination finds in these formless masses any point on which the former could rest with pleasure, or on which the latter would find entertainment or play, unquote. The imagination and even our visual sense are almost suspended because they do not find nothing that could keep them alive or interested. And the same holds for reason, which, now it's Hegel again, finds in the thought of duration, or this way of sublimity, nothing that impresses it. The sight of this eternal dead masses gave me nothing but the monotonous and its length tedious, in der Länge langweilige idea, it is so, es ist so, unquote. The only thing that there is to think in the formless masses of the mountains, the only thing that nature gives to us to think is that there is nothing to think in it. And even this thought has a temporality of its own. To think it for too long makes it boring. It's not a deep thought. There's no depth attached to it, or to which it could refer. With nature, one can only think what is in plain sight anyhow, and hence should only take seriously what the eyes can see. Nature is the identity of being and appearance, within which there is nothing else to think than what appears. What is there to think is a pure superficiality, one could say, is the thought specific to the type of a müssen ohne muss, of a need without necessity. I want to suggest Hegel will remain faithful to this position in his later life, when, for example, he notes that, I quote, and that's from the logic, for nature, on the surface of which contingency has, so to speak, its free sway, which could also be recognized without the pretension of intending to find in it an instance of being able to be only so and not otherwise, unquote. There is a fundamental, it is like this simply because it simply is like this in nature. It is in the sense that one can say it is contingent. What Hegel later scorns in the sphere of spirit, when spirit accepts and interprets determinations as unreasonable, opaque, that is in German unverstandenes Geschick, unreasonable and opaque fate, it is so, as is so. It is precisely the point he makes about nature early on. It is nature's point. Nature is unverstandenes Geschick. It's Geschick, and one can immediately think of a Heideggerian reading starting from here. It is fortune, but one that is constitutively not understood, unverstanden, not because it is misunderstood, even though it sometimes is, but because there is nothing in it to understand. We might qualify it as Unverstand, not as ignorance or stupidity, but as unreason or ununderstanding, which does not simply mark the negation of reason, but the absence of it. And we can talk about if that is negation or not. But this does not turn into a dark, deep, and ununderstandable mystery. It is fully understood when it is understood that there is nothing to understand, when its unreason is comprehended in thought. The early and pre-philosophical anecdotal concept of nature one can formulate here is that nature is a material manifestation of unreason, of Unverstand, wherein it is important only to think that there is nothing to think in it, but where it is of equal importance not to identify this as a deep thought, as there is no such depth in the appearance or thought of nature. So it's absolutely necessary to think that there is nothing necessary to think in it. That was very early Hegel, 1796. Now I'm jumping quite a bit historically. And at that point, it would have made a lot of sense to go through what Hegel says in Jena, when he first comes up with the first sketches of the system, when for the first time he actually systematizes his idea, and what happens even when he teaches the philosophical propedeutic in schools, because a huge part of it is also has to do with the concept of nature. We can potentially get to this in the discussion. I'm leaving this aside for now. Now, in 1812, Hegel publishes The Science of Logic, which seeks to expose, in this famous, grandiose formulation, I quote, God as he is in his eternal essence before the creation of nature and of a finite spirit, unquote. After the first edition, he's decided to again revise this exposition, but he will never get to the end of it before his very own end. And only at the Logic's end we make the move to nature properly. In the Logic, we get a very detailed version of what he previously called ontological logic. It is now distinguished into an objective and subjective logic, and therein into the doctrine of being, the doctrine of essence belonging to the objective logic, and the doctrine of the concept, which belongs to the subjective logic, but you certainly all know that. In the Logic, we think the formation of thought before there's anything to be thought. This is why we think thought purely, right? Hegel describes the structure of this exposition as the course of the fact itself, den Gang der Sache selbst. Thought is creative, gradually creating thought while thinking thought. And at some point, yet to be determined, it cannot but think nature. As all beginnings are simple and unavoidably opaque, especially when there is not even nothing given, Hegel calls the logic the realm of shadows. You all know this, the world of simple essentialities, free from all sensuous concretion, unquote, wherein we think the determinations of the absolute as that which is absolved of all determinations other than its own. These determinations are, Hegel, increasingly condensed, verdichten sich immer mehr in the thought process. Thinking thought is not poeticizing, it's not dichten, but condensing, verdichten. Thinking in this peculiar cave, because realm of shadows, of thinking, we start to qualify what thinking is. At the beginning of the logic, there is only, Hegel says, present the resolve, which can also be viewed as arbitrary and considering thinking as such, unquote. So we do not start the logic with any presupposition about what it is to think, but we start with the decision to think, and this is why this process that I very abstractly just tried to describe begins. Hegel begins by considering only the being, the pure being of this very resolve, which ultimately amounts to nothing, as it did not even tell us how to begin, but only that we begin, and this leads us into becoming, and so things start to pass. If you ever looked at the logic, you know this. With the beginning of the science of logic, we have moved into the very heart of Hegel's overall project. The material that I referred to earlier, he didn't publish it, right? It was just a scrapbook. But in the logic, we will get the first proper book form account of how to get from, well, maybe not the first proper, but a proper book form account of how to get from the logical idea to nature. And that is right now precisely what I will try to describe, how we get from what Hegel calls absolute idea to what he calls nature. Because this is where I suggest, or where de facto, an act of Entlassen takes place. This pass, so the pass from idea to nature, is part of the doctrine of the concept, i.e. of the subjective logic, and thus of the last huge part of the book. Hegel in general describes the concept as the truth of what he names the relationship of substantiality. So this is how we get into the subjective logic. To elucidate this claim, he turns to Spinoza's ethics, in which one should recall God is presented as nature, Deus sive natura, recall the last, recall this famous slogan. He turns to Spinoza to ultimately make a move from nature as substance, one could say, to freedom as subject. This move can, in a preliminary sense, be understood as a move from God as substance to God as subject somehow. Again, we're thinking God's thought before the creation of nature, right? And finite history. With it, we also learn that the truth of the concept of necessity ultimately lies in the concept of freedom. Hegel's traversal of Spinoza, which is could be endlessly discussed here, but I'm just dashing through it. Hegel's traversal of Spinoza does not externally point out a weakness in the latter system. Rather, he internally accentuates and inflates his strengths or its strength so that they are forced to cross the system's very own limits, and that Spinoza is metaphorically forced to claim what a system does not allow for, but at the same time what he cannot but admit. How is this possible? By showing that in the way in which Spinoza conceives of nature as substance, he's necessitated, and necessity is what substantially qualifies his concept of substance, hence of nature, to admit that the defining feature of substance, namely necessity, is itself posited, must itself necessarily be posited. It is not always already a substantial given. To abbreviate Hegel's argument massively, one could claim that Hegel will show how the necessity that Spinoza sees as a defining feature of substance can ultimately not be posited, but because it is the necessary feature of substance, it must be posited by substance, and hence by substance as subject of this very act of positing. Sorry, that was quick. This is what Hegel calls the unveiling, Enthüllung of substance, and this is the genesis of the concept. That was a quote. the unveiling of substance, and this is the genesis of the concept. Now it's me again. Now it is exposed, unveiled, revealed, uncovered, but also debunked, divulged, exposed as what it is, substance is. The unveiling of substance, substance laid bare, bare substance, is what makes the concept. It lost its shroud, cover, veil, and we realize that behind the veil is only what we, the subject, put there. We here encounter a substance barred, denuded, barred, and broken by the concept. The barred substance implies thus, because the logic of the concept is part of the subjective logic, a subjective stance. The substance's inner necessity only appears to be necessary because it was posited as being necessary, whereby necessity becomes the conceptual way in which an act of freedom appears. Hegel, here in grandiose terms, claims that, I quote, in the concept the kingdom of freedom is disclosed, eröffnet, unquote, unveiling the substance as something whose inner feature cannot be derived from the substance itself, but relies on the subjective positing act, disclosing the kingdom of freedom, that is the concept. As Hegel puts it, substance has been let go freely into the concept. Unquote. The concept gains through what Hegel says it calls its simple self-reference and absolute determinateness. The concept is absolutely determined because when we, for example, say freedom is freedom, we determine freedom absolutely by means only of itself. And this is what makes the concept into what Hegel calls the universal. But this self-reference of determinateness is just as much a negation of determinateness, in his words. Right? The self-reference of determinateness is just as much a negation of determinateness, unquote. This is to say, freedom is freedom, negates all other determinations to freedom than that of freedom. Thereby it also holds the concept is the singular. Right? It's absolutely universal and absolutely singular. In this sense, concepts are singularized universals. The kingdom of freedom is thus populated by concrete universals, and I quote Hegel again, the absolute universality, which is just as immediately absolute singularization in this very sense, right? Absolute universality and absolute singularization also constitutes the nature of the I and of the concept. This is why we get into the logic, subjective logic, and the logic of the concept with one at the same step. This means that the I is I, the pure I, is also structured like a concept. This is why the doctrine of the concept and the subjective logic are tied together in the first place. This means that the subject is something absolutely singular and absolutely universal, and because subjects use concepts, the subject is inherently populated by singular universals. There are the populations, as it were, in which we think. As Hegel supposedly claimed in 1817, I quote, because I do not know that I think, does not mean that I'm not thinking. Even sleeping and in an unconscious, bewusstlosem state, man is always thinking, denkend, unquote. This has repercussions for how to read the move from substance to subject. Since it may seem that now the substance is stable and can be identified with and in the conceptual realm, and therefore with the capacity to think. But because the concept is absolutely universal, it thinks in me. This is, I think, Hegel's point, even when I'm not aware of it. This means that it can happen that I not only do not know what I'm doing, thinking, but even more so that I might not even know what I'm thinking, right? The point is here that the subject substance is so universal that it can even escape the subject. But conceptual thinking is also absolutely singular. It mobilizes singular ways of singularizing this universality of thought. They are singular because thinking manifests in singular concatenations of concepts. They are posited by me. They are posited by me, even though I might not be aware of positing them. So there is thinking going on in me, right? That is the point where we are right now. And because thinking is the subject substance and thinking is not substantial, it is articulated in these let's say two polar or bipolar way. Thinking in this sense is always an expression of my freedom. What we thus think in the doctrine of the concept entails a concept of thinking which is bound together with a peculiar form of automatism that drives the freedom that is forming or affirming a singularly, because uniquely posited, collective, because made of multiple concepts, universal, because unified, absolute form. An absolute form that forms itself by uniquely shaping a commune of singularities. This highly abbreviated and condensed move through aspects of the doctrine of the concept was only supposed to allow me to understand Hegel's claim that, I quote, the concept is as such not yet complete, it must rather be raised to the idea. Because the idea is still the unity of reality, the idea is the unity of reality and the concept, and therefore this is crucial. Something has truth only insofar as it is idea, Hegel says. It is against this background that he claims that das Logische, the logic, I quote, exhibits the rise of the idea up to the level from which it becomes the creator of nature and passes over into the form of a concrete immediacy whose concept, however, again, shatters the shape also in order to realize itself as concrete spirit. We have finally moved to the point where the idea is addressed as a creator of nature. And it seems we encounter here the worst kind of idealism. I mean, there are endless critiques, right? That was what I referred to at the beginning. Part of the why Hegel's philosophy of nature is so horrible is because of that move. People said, I'm not saying that. It passes over into something concretely immediate, right? The idea does. What is the nature of this passing over of the idea into the concrete immediacy of nature? That is now the question that I wanted to answer all the time. Is it like a mother dying in childbirth? But if the idea is the coming together of concept and reality, the move into the reality of nature seems to be unavoidable once we generate the concept of the logical itself, wherein thinkingly examines itself, and we have that concatenation of concept and reality automatically. So Hegel indicates that the subjectivity of pure thought in the logic generates an objectivity that is adequate to itself. The concept reaches its truth when pure thought creatively determines its own form in the process of thinking itself. Thought thereby thinkingly determines how its singularly universal constitution is thought. This is like a true practice of thinking, truth production through thinking. It is truth production because what we think is fundamentally true with regard to how we think, and the two have become inseparable. This is what Hegel also calls the absolute truth, or the infinite idea in which cognizing and doing are equalized, which is why he can speak of an identity of the theoretical and practical. I'm not going into the details of that. We can, if you want to. We learn in the logic that thinking is a practice that is creative of ideas of what thinking is, and thereby what we do in the logic is to thinking by constantly thinking new ideas of what thinking new ideas of thinking is. And I think one needs all these loops. This absolute idea, I quote, the rational concept is the sole matter and content of philosophy. Sole matter and content of philosophy, the absolute idea. Now, philosophy is necessarily the philosophy of the idea. Hegel states that, I quote, nature and spirit are in general different modes of exhibiting its, that is the absolute idea's existence, art and religion, its different modes of apprehending itself and giving itself appropriate existence. Unquote. Nature and spirit exhibit the absolute idea. They exhibit the being there of the thought thinking, the creation of new ideas of thinking. In what is exhibited in nature and in spirit, thought thinks, the creation of new ideas of thinking. These are the two media, as it were, where we think new ideas of thinking, nature and spirit. In what is nature and spirit are thus different modes of the absolute idea. In the latter, that is spirit, it thinks itself and thus has its reality in the shapes of art, religion, and philosophy, and then it thinks the creation of new and historically situated ideas of thinking. But this must also mean that the thought also thinkingly creates new ideas of what it is, also when it thinks that which does not think, but from which it contingently or necessarily emerged, namely nature. The philosophy of nature is therefore what Hegel calls thinking consideration of nature. That's from a lecture. In what way can Hegel claim, I quote, the absolute idea is immediately nature, unquote? As Catherine Malabou elucidated, I quote, without this incorporation, logical life remains an abstraction. It would be a concept without reality. And in 1817, Hegel claims that, I quote, spirited being is the absolute idea itself, the concept as the idea intuiting itself is nature. The concept as the idea intuiting itself is nature. To abbreviate Hegel's own abbreviations even more, the absolute idea is embodied in the natural being that, therefore, when it comes to the concept of itself as thinking being, immediately understands that thinking beings have their embodied reality in nature. Thinking beings in thinking new ideas of thinking cannot but come up with the idea of thinking that thinking manifests in nature. This obviously does neither mean everything in nature thinks, nor that thinking is simply natural. But if we seek to intuit it, what thinking, let me put it like that, looks like, we merely see nature, something natural and thus not thinking. Right? This is why nature is not yet the most adequate version of the absolute idea. If, I quote, the absolute idea is immediately nature, it is in nature more or less than nature. It is, that's Hegel, the pulse that rises, der Puls, der sich erhebt. So not sublation, Aufhebung, but a rising, an elevation, Erhebung in pulse. The absolute idea thus does not show itself in nature as natural heartbeat, but as elevated pulse rate that will drive spirit out of nature. It should be clear that all this does not imply that thought would, I quote, precede nature in time and bring nature into being through a creative act. It is rather, unquote, it is rather that thought, thinking thought, cannot not discover that which precedes thought and from which it emerged. It is important to here emphasize that Hegel does not argue for a neat passing over into nature and a safe and unproblematic passage out of it. When thinking starts to intuit itself as and identify itself in nature, we are confronted with the unsettling aspects of what he otherwise and famously called the impotence, Ohnmacht of nature, the without power, ohne Macht of nature. Hegel means by this that, I quote, nature cannot abide by and exhibit the rigor of the concept and loses itself in a blind manifold void of concept. Right? That is why I wanted to bring in the early anecdotal reference, because he will stick to that. Looking at nature to pun the famous Kantian dictum, we encounter intuitions without concepts, which therefore are blind. Hegel suggests that this is why, I quote, again, we can wonder at nature, at the manifoldness of its genera and species and the infinite diversity of its shapes, for wonder is without concept, unquote. And this is again the point that Hegel had made already on the trip to the Alps. Nature's arbitrary productions and multiplicities, which are without concept and power, suggest a significance that at the same time cannot easily be appropriated by or converted into conceptual investigations. The concept of nature is, to a certain extent, without concept. Nature is impotent and incomplete. There are holes, gags, breaks, inconsistencies in it. And therefore it, I quote again, that's from the philosophy of nature, sets limits to philosophy, unquote. Because it makes us aware that, quote again, it is quite improper to expect the notion to comprehend, or as it is said, construe or deduce the contingent products of nature, unquote. Nature's productions are so void of concept that concepts have no power about certain parts of nature. This is less because nature's materiality, but due to its impotence and incompleteness. What can appear as nature's power over the concept arises from its very impotence. We here clearly see a certain opacity that remains in spirit's own understanding of itself, in thought's own thinking of itself when it starts to convey of itself, also as natural, i.e. as other being. This is not simply a result of its material embodiment, I want to emphasize that, but because this embodiment might not be neatly conceivable within any or appropriable by an overarching, consistent conceptual framework. That means that thinking does not properly think thinking without thinking incompleteness and impotence, and hence without that within which there is nothing to think. So thinking needs to think that wherein there is nothing to think to complete its own self-appropriation. This is my argument, right? But this puts even more pressure on how to conceive of the passing over of the idea into nature, which is also supposed to be a creation. And this is the last point I'm going to make. So what is the relation between thinking, that, I mean, is embodied, or that is what the absolute idea is, in my very abbreviated rendering, to what happens with nature. Encountering limitations in the grasp of the concept because of nature's constitution does not finitize thought. Hegel says it remains perfectly transparent to itself. We even have a concept of that which in its part is void of the concept, namely nature. That is what the concept allows for. But how then does this passage from thought to nature work? Hegel remarks that, I quote, das Logische, the logic, thus exhibits the self-movement of the absolute idea only as the original word, a word which is an utterance, Äußerung, but one that in being externally uttered has immediately vanished again, unquote. After God thought about the creation of nature and finite spirit, she spoke. She made her thoughts explicit and external, but God's word, after it had been uttered, immediately vanished, and instead of God's word, we just get an incomplete, impotent nature. This can obviously, that is Hegel's metaphors right now, mine. This can obviously mean that nature is itself the proof that God, as Almighty Creator, whose creation exhibits her very own consistency and perfection everywhere, does not exist, and that she strangely admitted it by giving us material proof of her own inexistence. This proof we can find in the inconsistencies of her creation, then. Nature is not a book, but an utterance with which God seems to tell us that she does not exist as the all-powerful creator. Because what we have to work with is impotent, inconsistent, and powerless. Like a world without a concept, mere spiel, drivel, and rambling. Nature, as form of appearance of what is left of the utterance of God's word after its vanishing, Hegel calls this the abiding of vanishing, das Bleiben, des Verschwindens, is actually God's proof that God is dead somehow. And if the logic depicts God's thought and ends with her speculative word, the word wherein God reveals itself, not to the world, but as nature, and hence, in some sense, as the world, and then also as finite spirit, is one that only reveals that there is nothing to reveal except that there is nothing to reveal. Nature is a world in expression, externalization, Äußerung, void of concept. Close to the end, last 3 minutes, I promise. I hope that is okay. I hope. Close to the end of the logic, Hegel speaks of what he calls the turning point of the movement of the concept. It originates in the absolute idea and consists in what he calls the demand for an infinite retrogression in proof and deduction, just as from the newly obtained beginning, a result likewise emerges as the method runs its course, so that the method would roll on towards to infinity as well, unquote. Very dense passage. I'm going to unpack it a bit. At the peak of the unfolding of the logic, we return to the beginning and repeat the movement, since we now have reached a more appropriate understanding of what the being of the resolve, the beginning at the beginning of the entire project that now has run its course was all about. Namely, to create and discover a new idea of what it is to create and discover a new idea of thought while thinking. So we move back and repeat the move forward. The dynamic of the movement that we then here encounter can be represented graphically, I think, by the infinity symbol. We determine things increasingly by returning and repeating the movement of the concept, which thereby has become infinite, and in this respect can be taken as one that has the immanent structure of truth or absolute form. And we will repeat this movement not only after we have completed the first repetition, but in some sense infinitely. That's Hegel's point. In this cycle of repetition, there's a movement of exteriorization, but it also holds that the greater the expansion, just as dense is the intensity, Hegel says, the greater the expansion, just as dense is the intensity. As if in an almost Nietzschean model of eternal return of the same that contains both a centripetal and centrifugal movement. This is what Hegel calls a reflection into itself. We are thus also bending the movement of thought, thinking the creation of new ideas, of thinking back to the resolve with which it began, and we are now even able to formulate the concept of a science of logic. Because bending backwards and repeating forwards, we totalize and think the entirety of the course we have passed. It is here that Hegel makes the final move. Thought's real rite of passage. By creating the concept of the science of logic in its entirety, we cannot but notice that we're still moving solely within the logical sphere. Or in Hegel's words, we are, I quote, shut up within subjectivity, unquote. And therefore there is, I quote again, the drive to sublate it and pure truth becomes the final result and also the beginning of another sphere in science. Thinking expands and contracts, condenses and displaces itself. And then there is the drive to sublate thinking, as if a drive to sublate sublation itself. But this seems impossible. It would bring back what it seeks to overcome. Thought thus cannot deduce material reality from itself, which is why the totality of the movement of the logic that we just, as if as a model thinkingly placed in front of ourselves, is here supplemented. It is supplemented with a kind of repetition of the beginning, of the resolve, of the Entschluss at the beginning. But here, the resolve, the Entschluss, and maybe that is the one speculative world that we really need to talk about, moves to something else or presents itself as something else. It is an operation that has vexed generations of Hegel readers and which he himself only indicates as anzeigen or alludes to. The absolute idea at the end, I quote, freely discharges itself, absolutely certain of itself, and eternally at rest. The resolve thus decides the free release or discharge of the idea. There's an Entlassen, an Entschluss, sich zu entlassen, a resolve to release itself. It seems to move, but it also, but thinking is also forever at rest. It leaves itself, but it stays put. To approach this, I think it's instructive, and these are the last, it's the very last bit, to note that a similar gesture occurs in other passages in Hegel, and this is what I'm going to bracket now, but we can get to that. There's a Entlassen at the end of the Phenomenology. There's an Entlassen playing an interesting role in the philosophy of right. Now, what I want to suggest is that what we get here with the Entlassen, and the Entlassen, the release, has its own peculiar negative internal negation, is how we need to make a step aside, or how Hegel makes an almost parallactical shift, a move to the side, a sidestepping, a parataxis, as it were, when it becomes clear that thought, sublating all its determination of itself, thinking, cannot but generate nature itself. And this move is that one that he creates, calls Entlassen. So at the peak of the dialectical self-conception of thought, there is a parallactical shift, a sidestepping. The release at the end of the logic operates like a peculiar determinate affirmation that affirms nature as a shape of the absolute idea. It resolvingly affirms that thought materially manifests in the realm of non-thinking and contingency. In this sense, it creates nature, namely a different nature as realm of the material embodiment of thought, or in short, the concept of nature. Right? This is why it's important to think nature. From this perspective, it is now clear why Hegel can claim that it acquires the standing of having been posited by spirit, and this makes it a product. He's talking about nature. Nature is a creation because it is the very concept with which thought thinking creates the thought of its own presupposition. It's a gesture of release because in creating this concept, it does not alter its own self-expanding, condensing movement of understanding itself. But it also accepts that nature and its own embodiment, void of concept, obeys its own, not rules, but impotence and incompleteness, and hence cannot be deduced from thought. So there is a peculiar, I think that is my argument. This is why I insisted that Hegel calls it God's utterance. At the end, we encounter an Entsprechung, and I mentioned that the absolute idea is always the adequation, right? The adequate relation between concept and reality. That in German is Entsprechung. So in some sense, God has spoken, but his utterance vanished. This is what we encounter at the end. An Entsprechung of the purely subjective and therefore surprisingly incomplete or incompleteness specific to the absolute idea, which manifests in the idea drive, but at the same time, it is perfect, right? And the incompleteness of nature. We therefore here, at the end of the logic, 3 more sentences, encounter 2 corresponding incompletenesses. The concept of the absolute idea on the one side is driven toward making itself objective, but cannot derive objectivity from its own movement and sublation. This now corresponds to the reality of the impotence and incompleteness of nature, void of concept, contingent, and so forth. The highest and the lowest, so to speak, here are the 2 sides of the same. The absolute idea is nature. This is what the resolve to release and lessen as articulation of the idea drive produces. 2 corresponding incompletes, concept and reality, are too much of incompletion. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Frank Rudda. It's been a pleasure to hear you. Right now, we'll pass to the second section of this conference, which will be the intervention by Dr. Fernando Huesca, which is here at my side, and I will give a little insight of his persona, of his trajectory in the academic world. He has a PhD by the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico in philosophy, of course. But there's also a bachelor in biology by our university, la Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla. It is part of the Sociedad Iberoamericana of Estudios Hegelianos, part of the Red Latinoamericana Leibniz, and has published a different variety of articles around Hegel's thought. The most recent of his publications is a book which is called Economía Política Clásica en Hegel, which translates for Political Classical Economy in Hegel. Capital political, so I will finalize this insight. I pass the word to him. Dr. Fernando Huesca, you may speak right now.
Gracias, Alberto. En nombre de la Sociedad Iberoamericana de Estudios Hegelianos y La Razón en la Historia, agradecemos al doctor Frank Rudda por su interesante presentación. Pues a continuación pasamos a la parte de preguntas y comentarios. Vamos a estar, Alberto y yo, mapeando el Facebook. Si hay alguna inquietud, la manifestamos en inglés para el doctor Rudda y así vamos generando la interacción. Voy a tomar primero la palabra con una pequeña pregunta sobre la evolución o variación, sobre las ideas de Hegel alrededor de la naturaleza, desde el periodo de Berna hasta el periodo de Berlín. Thanks, Frank. I cannot see you now. We're very thankful for your interesting conference. So we get to questions and comments. I have a first question for you, Frank. I wonder if you find any variations concerning Hegel's conception of nature from Bern to Frankfurt, to Jena, to Nuremberg, to Heidelberg, and Berlin. That's something to begin with. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fernando. I think you're absolutely right. And this is what I had to leave out. I mean, there is so much to say. So, because what he seems to be unfolding, so this is why I wanted to separate these two, let's say, even discursive representations of what Hegel says about nature. This is why the first one was anecdotal and morally biographical, but I try to emphasize that there is something conceptual in it. And I think he certainly sticks to elements of the early, maybe rather intuitive and scribbled concept of nature that he articulates. But what happens clearly in Jena, for example, is that he is very, very explicit about nature being, that's I think 1803-04, where he accounts for nature in such a way that it allows for the emergence of what I mean. This is the one concept that has been singled out by Slavoj Žižek out of that period. So what must nature be such that in it can appear a human being that he 1803-04, I think that is the correct time, describes as the night of the world, right? So as a peculiar type of nothing, as a peculiar materializing and materialized type of a nothing. What does that mean? So what are the material conditions to account for to account for such an emergence? Later on, I'm just very, very swiftly browsing through elements. So that is a change of perspective, right? So it is a perspective that takes nature as a material precondition for the emergence of something like the night of the world embodied in the human being. Now, that complicates a lot of things, and I think this becomes increasingly present in 1805, 1806, I'd say, namely that on some level, ontologically, with the emergence of human beings, for nature, nothing changes. I think that is the thesis that Hegel will articulate quite systematically. So for nature, for the structure of nature, that he later will start to describe, and there I think intuitively already does, as a system of steps, Stufen, or levels or layers, whatever the best translation of Stufen is. And I'm not certain about that. But so for nature, nothing changes with the emergence of spirit. But for spirit, everything changes with the emergence of spirit, obviously, right? Because then there is spirit. So that complicates. At that moment, he moves not only from giving an account as nature as bundle of contingencies, right, that are internally powerless, void of concept, and so forth, formulations that he uses later on. But he basically looks at nature from the perspective of the possibility of being the condition of possibility, the material condition of possibility of the emergence of spirit, that then complicates the relationship between and nature and spirit insofar as both have a very different perspective on what it means that there is an emergence of spirit, right? For spirit, as I said, everything changes. For nature, nothing changes. One would have, I think, to say a lot about also the work and the labor that the concept of life does from around 1800, I'd say, because there. So we're jumping a bit before the Jena period right now, because there, I think, at that point, life mediates, I think, what he perceives as infinite life, and that is his name of spirit at that time. That's the famous fragment that he wrote at that period, and a finitized kind of infinite that is nature. What does that mean? Nature is inherently infinite, but in a finitized way, because it comes up with infinitely many ways of creating finite beings and finite relations and so forth, but it cannot grasp itself. So in this sense, there the one finds the articulation of that nature is void of concept, or in some sense ohnmächtig, in some sense powerless and impotent, not in general, not to produce, but to grasp itself, right? But because this impotence only appears as impotence from a certain moment onwards, namely from the emergence of spirit, there is no experience, or whatever we want to call it, of impotence from the perspective of nature. So I think there let's say specifications and things get shuffled around a lot. what I was trying to do, I think, maybe I can put it like that, is to see at what precise point and in what precise way does nature as concept emerge as something that spirit cannot avoid, right? And what is that? What is precisely that kind of concept? And my suggestion now in the end, and I mean, you can tell me if you find that plausible or not, is when the movements of self-thinking that the logic depicts reaches a moment where Hegel refuses precisely to make the move that was always or often attributed to him, namely that logical thinking as such can generate materiality and so forth. What kind of concept does one need to make that claim? That was what I was trying to say. And for that precise reason, I tried to only, and you're absolutely right, one needs to be more specific, single out the feature of, let's say, an internal incompleteness or an internal inconsistency that at that point corresponds to the inability, to the impossibility of thought generating materiality and creating materiality all by itself. I hope that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Frank. So specifically concerning Jena, there you find courses on logic and metaphysics and courses on real philosophy, where you find a discussion on nature and society. So I wonder if you can say that in Jena you find already Hegel's philosophy of nature, or if it is something you find from 1817 onwards in the encyclopedia.
Yeah, that's no. Well, I only very, very passingly said that, right? I mean, so it is a very, I find it's not an easy claim to make if there is a formulated philosophy of nature, right? Because, I mean, in the sense that, of course, there is the encyclopedia version, totally, and there are the manuscripts and all that. I know that, but he never wrote a book in the sense that, right, the phenomenology or the science of logic is a book called philosophy of nature, even if he, right, I mean, because look at the encyclopedia, it's paragraphs, right? So it's structured very differently, right? So we don't get a book text, but we get really a teaching tool, which and Hegel, I mean, it says that on the cover, right? But it needs to be used for attending his lectures, right? So it's literally a teaching tool. So on some level, I'd be tempted, even though I think it sounds more provocative than I mean it, but on some level, I'd say there is no philosophy of nature. There is no totally formulated philosophy of nature, but he is working constantly on placing this concept somewhere, right? In 1800, he basically says, well, nature is what we address as essence. Right, I mean, nature on some level is another version of essence, but none of these attempts to actually think through what the concept of nature means is formulated fully systematically in any of the books, right? And then we can think about the complicated issues that he raises in the phenomenology when he's talking about nature observation and so forth, but this is why I singled out the logic, because this is a book wherein the concept of nature appears, and he even accounts for where it precisely appears, right? Namely, exactly at the end, where there is this drive of the idea to materialize itself, right? Which is absolutely, I mean, to my mind, absolutely astounding and surprising, simply because he deduced all the concepts that he is talking about beforehand, right? Subjectivity, objective, but then we remain in the subjective realm. I mean, isn't that quite something? But I think, I mean, this is the claim I wanted to make. This is where Hegel is the most materialist, right? He is the most materialist because he basically says, well, it is, of course, we can change matter when we look at it differently, of course. But we can't simply generate matter. I mean, Hegel is not Descartes, right? I mean, it is simply not the case, I think. And this is why I wanted to say, so what does he say about nature in one of the like books, right, that are not teaching tools, where we should have listened to him to get precisely the framework. And yeah, I stopped that.
Thanks, Frank. I'll get to Spinoza now that you mentioned materialism. I want to touch another subject matter first concerning sources. I think we can understand that during the 20th century, there was, as you mentioned, not much interest concerning Hegel's philosophy of nature, among other things, because it was understood that Hegel was not interested at all in the natural sciences. I think with new Hegelian sources, with intensive work which is being carried out at the Hegel Archive, we now have access to these materials from lectures, in this case, the lectures on the philosophy of nature. So I wonder if turning into these sources, we can reassess precisely Hegel's assimilation, interpretation of these natural sciences, so we can have a new view concerning his conception of nature and how philosophical science has to do with it. So taking into account this new fact of Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of nature, I wonder if one could sort of try a reconciliation or a new understanding concerning absolute idealism and Darwinism. I think there was complete alienation concerning Hegelian studies, even studies around German idealism. It was as if Darwinism as naturalism was completely opposed to idealism or absolute idealism in specific. So I wonder if there can be a new wave, so to speak, of Hegel lectures which could try to find new ways of communication between idealism and Darwinism with its empirism and naturalism. So that's another point.
Yeah, no, I think you're making a very strong and very convincing point. I mean, as you know and just pointed out, Hegel has been ridiculed many times for apparently rejecting evolutionary theory and being totally retrograde and in ununderstanding about the sciences of his time, and hence the that sort of ruined the whole idea of a Hegelian philosophy of the natural sciences. Absolutely. I think there have been, precisely because there was a brilliant archival work done in Bochum, new sources that allow for a reassessment. I also think that there have been, let's say, numerous attempts to challenge, at least, let me put it like that, if you enter the Hegelian philosophy of nature by assuming that, and by being able to show, too sketchily, yet as I tried to do just now, if there is a way of entering the philosophy of nature discussion by showing that nature as such, in Hegel as a concept, has an internal link to what I refer to, let's say, as incompleteness or inconsistency, I think that opens interesting perspective to contemporary scientific debates, even. And why is that? Because on some level, I mean, Hegel is absolutely clear. If you look at the actual philosophy of nature, at the encyclopedia version of the philosophy of nature, what is the first thing with which we begin in nature? It is space, right? So space precedes time, and space. Why is it space? I mean, if the formulation of Hegel is that nature is the absolute idea in its other being, then one could say on some level, and I'm trivializing a lot, but the absolute idea is, first of all, absence from nature, or appears in nature in the form of absence. And how does absence appear? Well, spatially, right? Now, if we insist that there is, and can argue that Hegel points out why inherently nature is incomplete, we get an account, and that would not only marry, let's say, Hegel's philosophy of nature with Darwinism. That's the work that, for example, someone like Adrian Johnston, I'd say a Zizek'ian Hegelian, is very interested in. I mean, he wants to marry contemporary evolutionary biology and contemporary evolutionary theory, and contemporary, let's say, natural science work with a Hegelian perspective on the philosophy of nature. But at the same time, if we even move that a bit into the earlier categories of the philosophy of nature, this is why I started to talk about space just a second ago, there might be very interesting ways of conceiving of a concept of space that is inherently incoherent, inherently inconsistent, inherently incomplete. Just think about contemporary debates in astrophysics, of which I'm not a specialist at all. But at the same time, if that is a claim to be made, that Hegel, and I think one can very consistently make that point, that nature, that the concept of nature in Hegel points to an entity that is inherently unable to, let's say, grasp itself. This is why the Stufen, or the steps, or the stages, or the levels are consistent and need to be reconstructed from a perspective of spirit, because nature doesn't do it, because it is inherently incoherent and incomplete and unstable. Let me put it like that. The most trivial version of that is the example that I think he gives in the Logic, where he basically says something, I'm making this up now, but if there are 77 or 79 forms of turtles, right? I mean, you can't deduce that from any concept whatsoever. There is no necessity on that level, and not simply because it's merely quantity, but it's a structural feature. And if that is a structural feature, that structural feature must hold for all natural categories, even the first one, which is space. And if that is the case, well, I think the link to, let's say, more complex accounts of space as being discussed contemporarily in astrophysics is very inviting and is immensely productive.
Great. Frank, I wonder if you could post here on the chat the name of this Hegelian Darwinian so that we can share it with the public. Now, I understand that you propose taking the science of logic as a sort of philosophy of science, which would include the idea that empirical research on nature is, so to speak, infinite. So that would make Hegel quite relevant for scientific multidisciplinary studies, I would say, in the present. I'll go back to Spinoza concerning materialism. I wonder, Frank, oh great, that's the name. I wonder if you could comment a bit concerning Spinoza's view on nature and Hegel's.
Yeah, so the point that I tried to make, and I think it's an interesting point, is that this is why I raised the question at one early stage of what I was saying. Is there any necessity, if we indulge and embark on a project and begin with a project that the science of logic begins, namely a project which wants to make us thinkingly understand, I mean, to give it a very trivial formulation, what thinking is, right? So by bracketing all presuppositions, even the presupposition, one could say that one should bracket all presuppositions, right? This is why I emphasize the God perspective. So Hegel insists that the science of logic is something like a thought protocol of God thinking before the creation, that is thinking during the creation of nature and finite spirit. This is what he suggests, right? So why then is Spinoza becoming important? Not simply because of but he is becoming important, and I'm going to say something more about the passage where I think he becomes important. He becomes important because the question then is Hegel here taking a Deus sive natura position? So is what we're actually getting ultimately, because we think God before and also during the creation, is that an account of what nature as productive and as productive in some sense of itself is? Why that is a possibility is because in some sense, and Hegel, I think, is absolutely clear about that in the Heidelberg lectures that he gives in 1817, because we can God only think as spirited beings after God created spirited beings, and hence only with the creation God properly becomes God conceptually, right? He only becomes the creator when he created, when she created, when it created. So in some sense, what God is doing is incomplete before the creation. But that raises the question: is that type of creation similar to the creation or to the account of productivity and creation that we get in Spinoza's Deus sive natura, God as a nature account? And now the move that I think Hegel makes in the logic, at least, is that he suggests that and this is why I started with emphasizing that Hegel endorses the view that nature is essentially contingent on a very profound level, because what we get in Spinoza is the assumption that nature is essentially on some level necessary, right? On some level necessary, and that that nature is on some level, namely very profoundly necessary, because all these God as nature must mean that everything in nature is necessary and not simply contingent. That's the big move away from Descartes on some level, where God is embodied by contingency. The whole question is, what is the status of that necessity? And now, what I think Hegel is doing in the discussion with Spinoza and the logic, he makes the very move that I just referred to as the move at the very beginning, that God is only God when he, she, it creates, and hence there is, let's say, more than a necessary concatenation. So on some level, it is necessity, one could say, namely because God would not be God if he, she, it didn't create, and hence there is some necessity. Yet at the very same time, this creation cannot be accounted for only in terms of necessity. So there is something else. It is also something else must be there, namely a positing of God as God by him, her, itself, in such a way that this act of positing is what I think Hegel at the later stages of the phenomenon of the logic indicates is missing in Spinoza. What am I trying to say in that meandering way? I'm trying to say that Spinoza cannot account for the necessity of the concept of necessity from that perspective, right? Because it must be posited. It must be a positing of something that is presupposed to make this whole thing and this whole account work. And that is, I think, what changes the concept of nature profoundly, because it changes the concept of nature, because nature then must be something posited as a presupposition that at the very same time cannot simply be derived from the concept of necessity. I hope that makes sense.
Great, thanks. That sounds to me that Spinoza and Hegel are not creationists concerning the Darwinian debate, and their God seems to be a logical God, not a personal or a God in a theological sense. I have a last question, Frank. I wonder if you could tell us something about other enlacens in Hegel's system. I recall you mentioning enlacen in the phenomenology and also in the philosophy of right.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, there is the one thing that I wanted, but then as you noticed, time was too short and always is lacking ontologically almost. There is this passage that I think would be interesting to look at. There's an Entlassen, a release going on in the philosophy of right when Hegel wants to account for the reproduction of civil society, namely for what he calls the release of the son into the of the son, right, of the family into the bosom of civil society. That is an Entlassen, a very peculiar Entlassen, because it has something to do with the dissolution of the family. It's part of the dissolution of the family, part of the reproduction in the dissolution of the family. But this is a very, very, very inverted one almost, because the Entlassen that we're dealing with in the philosophy of right begins with something rather natural, right? Family, right? A rather natural social bonds, something rather contingent, because it relies on a love relationship, which this is why it can just break up and fall apart and so forth, right? Into something that is rather, let me put it like that, cultural, or I know the family is civil institution, but I'm aware of that, and of course, but it's rather natural, and Hegel describes it as another rather natural kind of relationship to family. But then the let's say the release, the Entlassen of the son into it, is a release and Entlassen into culture and into freedom and into something else. It would be, I think it would be interesting and worth a longer discussion if that type of Entlassen is the same type of Entlassen that happens in the closing moments, for example, of the science of logic and the closing moment of the phenomenology. I don't think it's the same kind of Entlassen. I think it's a different kind of Entlassen. It's a different kind of release. One reason I just gave, because I think the direction is kind of opposite, right? So it's rather reproductive, not creative. It moves from nature to culture, not from thought to nature, as at the end of the end of the science of logic. And there is, of course, an Entlassen at the end of the phenomenology, where Hegel speaks of in the I think next to last page, when in Absolute Knowing, right? So next to last page of the entire book, of a release into nature and history that is somehow similar, right, on some level, to what then happens as creation of nature and history in the science of logic, right? So what I'm trying to say with that is that I think on the one hand side, one has to read the phenomenology and the logic together, right? I think they're both necessary requirements, because I'd argue that each step of the logic does only work if we always and repeatedly reread the phenomenology, because only then we understand what we're doing. We're getting rid of the presuppositions that keep returning in each moment of the development that Hegel is describing in the science of logic. So these two, let's say, transitory releases, so at the end of a book, seem to be different releases than the releases that we find in the conceptual, in the midst of the elaborations of dialectical unfolding. I'm saying that this way because I think it is interesting to think about ending with a release and continuing with the release. I mean, that would be my operative distinction, right? I mean, so, and civil society reproduces itself through releasing ever new sons into civil society, right? That is Hegel's account. But I'm not sure that what we find at the end of the logic is reproductive. It is, I think, genuinely creative in some sense, and that was what I was trying to bring out. Like so because thought admits thought thinking itself, so God as this logical God, thought thinking itself cannot but admit it cannot generate nature. Right, so that Entlassen that is happening there is different from the Entlassen where we reproduce ourselves in the same form that is going on in the philosophy of right. That would be my hunch. Yeah, I stopped there.
Sorry. Great. Thanks, Frank, again for your wonderful talk. We hope to see you again, and we hope to have another chance to talk about transitions in Hegel's system.
That would be absolutely lovely. I would adore that. Thank you so much for having me. That was a real pleasure.
Well, in our business, I thank you both for your participations, and I thank the public for watching. Even though we have not have any question right now in the commentaries, I suppose that maybe this conversation has arised new thoughts and concepts, or maybe interest in those who have heard you both. I thank yourself. I thank you both, Dr. Frank Rudda and Fernando Huesca. Fernando for the organization, and you, Dr. Frank Rudda, for finally making this happen. It's been quite a conversation and a conference, and I hope that we be able to find another time and spaces to talk about these topics that have bring us together, even though we speak different languages and are in different parts of the entire world. Thank you very much to those who have seen us and those who are in there. Keep in mind that we will always try to create these spaces where these ideas and these topics can be discussed in different formats, in different languages, and in different times. See you next year for the studies for the fifth Hegelian studies that we will take part here in the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla. Thank you very much.